We are happy Today, we are happy to welcome Dr. Sharfstein, our Vice Dean of Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, to our seminar series this morning. Dr. Sharfstein is a Hopkins Distinguished Professor of the Practice and Health Policy in Management and serves as the Director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative. Prior to coming to Hopkins, Dr. Sharfstein trained as a pediatrician and served as a former health commissioner for the city of Baltimore. He was also the principal deputy commissioner of the FDA and secretary of the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Dr. Sharfstein is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Public Administration. This morning, we have asked him to present to us on his experiences working with some controversial issues at the FDA. While we would all like to think that regulatory decisions are made strictly on the basis of science, as we have seen most recently with COVID, this is sometimes not the case. So we're all excited to hear about your experiences. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Sharfstein.
See if I can share my slides here. Can you all see those?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Sharissa, and I'm excited to be here and talk about clinical trials controversy in the FDA. So it sounds like we have till about 9:30. I'm definitely not going to go that long, so I'm hoping that we have a chance for a lot of conversation. I'll probably say a few things that will spark some disagreement maybe, or a question. So I'm looking forward to that part particularly. All right, so I'm orienting this to the clinical trials audience, since I think this is a clinical trials group. I think when it comes to clinical trials, questions come up for the regulator all the time, including how best to assess safety, how to assess efficacy, and how to balance benefits and harms. So I'm going to go through each of these with a case and kind of talk about what I think some of the lessons of that case are. And I was the principal deputy commissioner. I was actually the acting commissioner of FDA for a few months in 2009 under the beginning of the Obama administration. And then after Dr. Hamburg was confirmed as commissioner, I became the principal deputy, and I did that until January 2011. So a couple years at the FDA, which is, it's kind of like dog years, a couple years at the FDA, as Nancy Cass is finding out, is a very long time because so much is happening all the time. And there are many issues and they continue. All right, let's see. So let's start with assessing safety. I don't know if it's possible to mute. There you go. Okay, perfect. All right, assessing safety. I want to talk about rosiglitazone, otherwise known as Avandia. So rosiglitazone is a medicine for diabetes, still on the market. It was approved in 1999 on the basis of basically controlling hemoglobin A1C and diabetes. It was a very popular, heavily marketed drug. Sales went up to $3 billion by 2006, so very popular drug. But then in 2007, there was a meta-analysis published that indicated a substantially increased rate of myocardial infarction. So we had a pretty serious safety question arise, and that created a lot of turmoil for the agency and for regulators around the world. The people who did that meta-analysis, let's just say, were not shy about saying that they thought the drug should be taken off the market and that it was unsafe. And how could this have been missed? In 2010, now this is when I was at the FDA, the drug was suspended entirely from European markets, and we wound up putting significant restrictions on it. These were some of the headlines around that time. Stop prescribing killer diabetes drug, scientists warn. Now, some of the meta-analysis were from multiple small randomized controlled trials, but there were also observational studies that were published that also indicated a substantially increased risk. And people had all kinds of theories as to why. Every day you spend thinking about it, people are asking, why you haven't done anything already. and what went wrong. We actually, right before the decision, what wound up happening is at FDA is we convened an advisory committee. And we asked the questions to the advisory committee. What do you think? How strong is the meta-analysis data? How strong is the observational data? What do you think of this safety study? And what ultimately do you think should be done? And around that time, I was looking for it, but I couldn't find it. I think one of the major publications, it might have been Time Magazine, said something like, this is the drug safety crisis of the century for FDA or something like that, or another drug safety crisis of the century hits FDA. And people said there's just no win for this because some people were saying, look, there just isn't good enough data from, meta-analysis is not rigorous enough to justify this. And we need just a much bigger randomized controlled trial. You can't rely on the observational data. That observational data is just indicative of the need to do a randomized controlled trial, but you can't do anything on that basis. There was a large safety study planned, huge safety study planned, but with so many people saying it was a killer drug, there was a question about whether or not you could ever enroll people in that study. And we actually asked the National Academy of Medicine about whether it was ethical to enroll people, whether there was, a reasonable equipoise between getting this drug and not, given the data from the meta-analysis and the observational data. And basically, the National Academies wrote back and said they did not recommend continuing the study, and the study was stopped. So we had no large safety study. And at the time we decided to make an announcement, we gave the advisory committee a few options: keep it on the market with no restrictions, have a big safety study, and all the way up to take it off the market completely. And they wound up recommending leaving it on the market with major restrictions, although there were a lot of votes for taking it off the market completely. And the time we announced this decision, I was really committed to transparency at FDA. That was one of my particular interests. And when we announced it, I wanted to have an article in the New England Journal of Medicine at exactly the same time. HHS told us that it would be like disclosing confidential information to send this to the editors in advance. So we announced it at noon, submitted it at 12:01, and it was online in formatted version within a couple hours at the New England Journal. And we wrote a long article about why we wound up doing this. And it was pretty generally well received by most people about the rationale for what we did. Now, there's some interesting aftermaths of this. So in 2013, after another safety study came in, the FDA removed some of the restrictions for rosiglitazone-containing diabetes medicines. Although the people who were convinced that the drug was a problem felt like that safety study wasn't done that well, and there were some internal problems with it. So this remained controversial. In 2019, FDA actually completely eliminated the REMS program and just allowed it to be prescribed without any restrictions whatsoever, although it has never taken off. And ominously, they said, well, there's a whole new class of drugs like Ozempic. So rosiglitazone probably doesn't have a huge future. Most recently, there was another paper looking again at meta-analysis through all the updated data and still finding a significant increase in cardiovascular risk. So this is an example where you have, so this kind of illustrates this case, I think, how challenging safety questions can be, in part because, of course, definitive trials are powered largely for efficacy and are limited in information that may be generated for safety. And so you're approving things not knowing the full safety record. And of course, the trials are only in certain populations, and you expect that others will get the medicine. And so this is kind of a story about the limitations of randomized controlled trials. You can't answer every safety question with a randomized controlled trial, particularly around rare risks or in other populations. So you have to ask yourself how much you trust meta-analysis. And as a regulator, are you going to take a medicine off the market? Are you going to put severe restrictions on based on meta-analysis or based on observational studies? like I said, there can be ethical considerations and practical considerations. I don't think this study, separate from the ethical considerations, was ever going to be viable because of, you're trying to enroll people in a study. Just imagine that informed consent. The general standard, ethical standard, I know we may have some ethicists on the line here, but I think of the general ethical standard as having to disclose for informed consent of telling people what they kind of need to know. And I guess the question would be, is it reasonable to tell people that, the head of cardiovascular medicine at the Cleveland Clinic thinks this drug should be off the market, and a whole bunch of people think it's an unsafe drug based on multiple meta-analysis and observational studies. So imagine that kind of informed consent and telling people, we're not really sure whether this causes heart attacks, but we want you to be in this trial to help us figure that out. So it's a conundrum, really, because evidence that's suggestive, if you can resolve it with a randomized controlled trial, that would be ideal. But what if you can't resolve it? And does having a lot of suggestive evidence make it harder to resolve it? And then you have this issue that people get latched on to their views. And then as more data evolves, people tend to see the new data through the prism that was there before. And I don't want to name names, as they say, but, somebody who has staked their reputation in a way on saying a drug is unsafe and more data comes in, how likely is it that they're going to be able to fully look at that without their prior, recognition that they were they were really convinced this was a really unsafe drug. But the flip side of that is someone who made a regulatory decision and is really supportive of it may be resistant to see the challenges and may want to make the case that the medicine really can be used widely. I'll tell you this one story, which is we were putting people together on the advisory committee. And one of the questions that comes up for the commissioner's office, because this was all handled by the center, is waivers from conflict of interest. So we've got a huge amount of national scrutiny on the future of rosiglitazone, and we have to decide about whether we're going to give any waivers for conflict of interest for people to be on there. And so, hopefully you'll understand why I say we weren't excited about giving waivers. We thought that would be perhaps a controversial thing that we'd have to answer. Why are we giving a waiver? But nonetheless, the center came to us with a particular person who they wanted to give a waiver to. And we said, well, why do you want to give a waiver? And the person had some connection with the manufacturer of the product. And they said, because of how smart this person is. This person is so smart. You could stack up 1 million epidemiologists or 100 epidemiologists in one corner, and we trust this person. This person wrote the textbook. This person, it was just one thing after another about how brilliant this person was, how insightful this person was, how helpful it would be to all the colleagues, that this person just got a small amount of money from the company, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we said, okay, we'll think it over. And we were thinking about whether to grant that. And then they called back and said, turns out the conflict doesn't exist. So you don't have to issue a waiver, and we're putting this person on the committee. So we were like, okay, and we knew that the team was somewhat skeptical of the safety concerns and felt kind of attacked by all these articles, like how come FDA hasn't acted earlier? And so they really wanted this one person on there. So I was kind of keen to see how this person would vote, right? And so turns out this person voted to take the medicine off the market. So then we got back on the phone with them and we said, well, what do you guys think? And they had all kinds of issues. And I said, well, how persuasive was this guy? The most brilliant person, the person you would stack up against 100 epidemiologists, and that guy is just one of many. Once he took a different position, then their perspectives shifted. So I mean, it gave me a little bit of a sense that that it is true that people have these hardened views, that safety issues can become actually very personal. I think some people inside and outside, particularly outside the agency, personalized it. It's like this person who's not making a good decision. And that is very, very hard to manage if you're trying to oversee the agency. And then, of course, the big picture here is it's important to have effective safety systems. and good use of non-randomized data and some, ability to take little bits of data and see the big picture and make decisions in the context of what you have. There's an art to safety assessment. It's not just a science. The science would be if you could do, a 100,000 patient safety study over 10 years, immediately. But if you can't do that, you have to make these decisions in the setting of uncertainty, and that can be hard. So those are my thoughts about safety with rosiglitazone as an example. Let me pause, if it's okay, and see if there are any questions or comments on the safety discussion.
Just a quick comment. Seems to me that safety always has to be evaluated in the context of both efficacy and alternatives. I say that as a clinician where sometimes we use treatments we know are risky because there are no alternatives, and the option is loss of organ. And just a comment and your response in that.
I think you're totally right. I do a lecture on just introduction to FDA for public health students, and I say, I've got a drug, it kills 10% of its patients. How many people think it's safe? And should we approve it? And, nobody raises their hand, and I go, that's too bad, because it's the only drug available for a disease that kills 100% of the patients, And then everybody raises their hand, and I go, oh, did I tell you there was another drug that doesn't kill anyone? And then nobody raises their hand. So I completely agree with you that safety is, that safety has to be put in that context. But even within that context, you have these data issues, How much is this safety concern going to weigh on you, right? Like if you believe meta-analysis or you don't believe meta-analysis, or you are going to think about the various, types of data out there, you still have to make this assessment in order to balance it with whatever other considerations you have. And I think that here, there's some data on diabetes, but one of the key arguments that was made by the critics of this drug is that why are you treating diabetes? What are some of the biggest risks for diabetes? It's cardiovascular disease. So if like you're treating diabetes to prevent the heart attack, but it actually causes more heart attacks, what are you doing? That was part of the argument here. It wasn't quite like, a drug where it's treating pain but causing gastrointestinal bleeding, and you have to like weigh one kind of thing against another. These here, the benefit and the risk were very much attached to each other. But all this speaks to, all the different considerations you have to take into account. I mean, there was another drug that was being considered at the same time. I didn't get it, and also in the same class, but didn't maybe have the cardiovascular signal, but did have a signal, I think, for bladder cancer. And so that complicated, kind of the assessment of this a little bit. But I think even with all those particulars, these issues kind of come through. Other comments or questions?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Dr. Sharfstein. Thank you for the lecture. I just had a question on whether you thought that, all the controversy around rosiglitazone had an impact on FDA being able to have a more post-marketing, I guess I wouldn't say privileges, but Congress granting FDA more power in post-marketing safety surveillance. I'm not sure if you had any input on that or any thoughts.
One of the things that we did is we asked the Institute of Medicine to help structure, like, well, what would be the right way to really evaluate the safety of drugs over their life cycle. And they did a very thoughtful report that really didn't lead to a lot of changes. It's still very challenging, and there's still a lot of dispute about the value of different kinds of data to inform post-marketing assessments. I think the agency does better, sort of getting companies to complete clinical trials or other analyses that they promised to do. The agency has set up more safety systems to try to capture observational data and look at it. But I think this same kind of problem could happen again because some of the underlying issues haven't been, really fully resolved. So I think it's definitely still a challenge to think about. One of the ironies here is that, you know, I came to believe personally, I'll just say, that you have to look at all these kinds of data and you have to be thoughtful and make the best decision and get the best expertise and make decisions in the setting of uncertainty. Now, that meant that I was not a RCT absolutist when it came to safety. Okay. And I embraced that. That was my view, that like each decision was difficult, but you needed to look at the evidence that you had. You know, we can talk about whether you agree. But then, of course, in the intervening years, all that has flipped. And there's a lot of interest at the FDA of using non-randomized data for efficacy, you know, and potentially they call real world data often. And they want to use real world data potentially to inform additional indications on drugs and things like that. And it's very interesting to me that the debate that happened over safety over rosiglitazone had people at the FDA saying it's got to be a randomized trial, and it had other people saying, you know, don't be an RCT absolutist. And then on the efficacy question, people kind of switch sides. The FDA saying, oh no, don't be an absolutist. There's all this good data out there. And some of the same people were saying, you know, don't be an absolutist on safety. You're saying you absolutely need an RCT for efficacy every single time for everything. Don't trust any of the other data. It's not that good. I think I'm trying to be consistent, and I am open to using real world data, but again, very thoughtfully to be informative to efficacy questions too. I don't think it's just completely irrelevant, but again, that's my view. Someone else had a question, I think. Harold?
Yeah, yes, Josh, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to listen to you. I just, you know, I'm teaching a course on clinical decision analysis, and I point out that every 2 years, SMDM has a panel on why nobody listens to us. And so I asked a question to you as well. We have decision analysis is a formal way of doing everything you're talking about, and it's not used. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, interesting. You know, I don't know. You could tell me maybe in the intervening years whether FDA has like adopted a formal decision analysis approach to these questions. But no.
ISPOR, I think, supports it, but other folks on this line know much better than I do the FDA position. I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, it really did not factor in to this, like that, you know, I think that the in part, you know, we asked the national academies to help us with fundamentally that kind of idea. Like, you know, can we set up the principles and approaches in advance so we're not like winging it every time? And I think that that has always been hard. I think that the FDA, though, did put in place a number of structures to make it a little easier. But just to give you a sense, when we got to rosiglitazone, people disagreed in talking to the advisory committee kind of about what their job was. So let alone the specific, you know, how these different pieces of evidence fit in. But people were disagreeing, like, that's not our job, this is our job, you know? And it's really important to get as much of it set in principle in advance so that you're really talking about the things you need to be talking about and not trying to argue about kind of the base assumptions when you're trying to, you know, resolve a particular case. I think this was difficult, and I have, you know, looking back, I have empathy for everyone who was involved, but you can just see how, you know, you're the one who discovers something, you're really going to push the agency in a particular direction. The agency feels defensive. Like, how do these things actually play out in a way that people can respect, you know, the outcome? We did our best to be as transparent as possible, to explain our thinking in different directions. But you can, you know, it's still a contested issue. You could have a whole panel on rosiglitazone safety, and some people would say this is the FDA that's worst. It reacted to the mob concerns, and there's nothing ever wrong with the drug. I don't know whether they go that far, but they might. And then other people would say, can you believe that FDA, you know, was so defensive that they kept removing these restrictions even when there was so much evidence to say that there was risk? Shariza?
Thank you. One question that's always been kind of at the back of my mind, you know, with FDA and these major decisions that impact large classes of drugs and large swaths of patient populations, to what extent do the decisions of other regulatory agencies across the world come into play? How are those conversations had, and do they have an impact?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's good to be aware, you know, and often some of our sister agencies are pretty transparent about their thinking. So they'll share with us their announcement, but also their rationale, you know. But I would say the general attitude at the FDA is, you know, it's interesting to see what other people are doing. They're going to be very interested to see what we do, you know. I don't think it's really particularly persuasive, other than like the merits of the argument, not like the fact that EU may do something. But people will go right to the merits and say, well, we look at this differently, we look at that differently. I mean, just to give you a sense of what this is like, I was at the agency, you know, where we're working on caffeinated alcoholic beverages. I'm going to switch over to food here. If some of you may remember Four Loko when it was all the rage. And we got a big letter from CDC saying there's a problem with this, you know, that bringing caffeine and alcohol together, it's not a good mix. It's like causes this condition of kind of wide awake drunk and all this stuff. And I sat down with some of the people at FDA and I was like, well, what do you think? And they said, well, they're an outside constituent. You know, we'll see what we think, but you know, no, this shouldn't cause us to change any of our thinking at all. So I think that in general, FDA, and this is not a bad trait, really feels like it makes its own decisions.
Fair enough.
All right, why don't we keep going? I'll talk a little bit about efficacy. So this was not while I was at the agency, but I followed this, you know, somewhat closely. You all may be familiar with eterlepsin. It treats Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is an absolutely horrible disease, no alternative treatments. It's a genetic treatment with the idea that it counters the genetic error in the disease. There was a study that included 12 patients. It had no clinical improvement, but it did have an increase in dystrophin, which was a key protein related to the disease. It was a small increase. This caused major controversy within the FDA. Was this truly evidence of effectiveness in, you know, in a meaningful way? The review division said no. The head of the Center on Drugs said yes. The chief scientist, who was appealed to, said no. And so it all went to the commissioner then, who is now the commissioner today, Dr. Califf. And in a very closely watched decision, he decided that he didn't want to decide, that this was not for the commissioner to decide, that this was for the head of the Center on Drugs to decide. And so the drug got approved through accelerated approval. Accelerated approval requires a determination that there is a intermediate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And it requires a definitive study. And so the FDA did provide accelerated approval to this medicine over the advisory committee. I do not think supported it, nor did the review division, nor did the chief scientist. And it was then marketed at a very, very high price to patients with muscular dystrophy. This came out in January 2020, and a number of years later, 4 years later, FDA has incontrovertible evidence of a significant likelihood of serious infections, including sepsis, septic shock, and possibly death from this medicine. And yet there was no evidence to date of clinical effectiveness. We possess no more knowledge than we did 3 years ago in terms of the likelihood that small amounts of truncated dystrophin will lead to clinical benefit. That was the intermediate endpoint. And in bolded letters, he said, please understand your failure to initiate the confirmatory study with due diligence. So it's now 4 years later, they're charging a lot for the drug. They have not started the trial, is very concerning to FDA and is a concern to the public. So here we have a clinical trial that shows something, but there's huge disagreement on what that something is. And so I think some of the key issues for efficacy in this case are, what is a meaningful benefit? And what's the appropriate use of accelerated approval? The idea for accelerated approval is to provide access to medicines that are on the pathway to approval that have very suggestive evidence while you're collecting the definitive evidence. But there are a lot of questions about the FDA's use of accelerated approval. On what basis is the disease or drug considered eligible? Should the eligibility criteria be more transparent? How are surrogates qualified as reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit? What level of transparency should FDA be providing? There was obviously aducanumab created this problem as well, or reflected this problem. When should an advisory committee be convened, and what should be the correct questions posed to it? It's very frequent that companies fail to complete definitive studies on time. Congress gave FDA a little bit more authority over accelerated approval, in part because of some of these challenges, allowing FDA, for example, to require that the definitive study be started, I believe, before accelerated approval is granted. Should there be more financial incentives or penalties to encourage completion? There's a bipartisan idea out there that during the accelerated approval phase, companies shouldn't be able to charge whatever they want. That should be weighted for a real proof of clinical effectiveness. And I think there's another issue with accelerated approval, just more generally, which is, sometimes these things work, sometimes they don't. And maybe this is a more general comment about clinical trials and controversy at the FDA, which I think we should learn from these experiences more than we do. Are there approaches to looking back on accelerated approval? Some of these drugs pan out, some of them don't. What can we learn from those to inform going forward? There was a time I went to some of the leadership at FDA, and I was like, I've got a great idea. And it was like, uh-oh, here comes Josh with another great idea. And I said, my idea is, let's look back X number of years, and let's find like the drug, regulatory crisis of the century for that year. Because there was always one. It could be safety, could be effectiveness. And let's bring people together, talk about what happened, bring in a historian, bring some of the people who were engaged, talk about what we learned, look at the evidence afterwards, see what the learnings are, and kind of like detoxify the environment around it while we're learning together from what happened, because nobody's perfect. People can be wrong. Why don't we do this? If people looked at me, like I said, I have an idea. On Wednesday, nobody wears underpants at the FDA. Stick with me here, stick with me here. Like people had no interest in this idea. I think it's very, very hard to do this job. They immediately said, well, people will just be so critical. If we say that we did something wrong, people say, well, the FDA screwed this up and it'll really undermine us. And I said, pick X equals 30 years. We're going to go back 30 years and see what we learn. We're not going to do anything for the last 30 years. And it's like, no interest, try again with another great idea. Why don't I keep going so we have plenty of time for discussion here. Actually, let's just pause. Let's pause. Comments, questions on efficacy controversies like eterlepsin or accelerated approval? Yes, Janet.
Hi. Yeah, you mentioned aducanumab, and so that, started out on a regular track, but ended up on accelerated approval. And then the next drug comes along and has, moderate, I don't know if moderate is the right benefit, I'm not, Alzheimer's, and gets approved for standard approval. I think something went wrong there. That because accelerated approval allows less evidence for clinical benefit by only requiring one trial.
No, accelerated approval requires no evidence for clinical benefit.
I know, but once you are an accelerated approved drug,
yeah,
what happened with lecanemab is they only need one trial.
Right, understood.
Yeah, and I do believe the aducanumab, they were actually planning on 2 standard trials, but that, was a can of worms for them. But so they got the accelerated approval, but here the next drug comes along, and because of the accelerated approval status, and I guess because it's a similar drug, only requires one trial for lecanemab.
Well, so the one trial versus two trial question is interesting, and I don't know that I really can speak to it comprehensively. I would say that there are certain, there's certain drugs where it's like 3 patients and it gets approved because it's a fatal drug and a fatal disease and a very strong mechanism, and suddenly the kids are, able to regain their function or preserve their function, and it's clearly a miraculous drug, and you don't even need a control group and you can do it. It depends a little bit. I don't know the details on the Alzheimer's drugs of 1 study versus 2 studies or what they were particularly thinking. I think the issue for accelerated approval for aducanumab was that they kind of switched the goalposts. They said this is going to be a study that is about clinical benefit, and they're like, oh, no clinical benefit, but we're going to adopt a marker as reasonably likely. But of course, the FDA's only published statement about that marker was that it was not reasonably likely. So that created, sorry, fix this, a bit of a challenge for them. But each study, I think this speaks to like, are we, what is the study really trying to demonstrate? If it's a study trying to demonstrate clinical benefit, and that's what it's powered for, and you don't see clinical benefit, then it's a negative study. If it is a study designed for clinical benefit and you see clinical benefit, then it's a positive study, but I really can't speak to the details of the Alzheimer's drug just because I really haven't tracked it that closely.
Well, thank you. But I just add that, the context is huge here with the prevalence and incidence of Alzheimer's drug going into our future and the cost of these drugs. So,
Well, it absolutely is. And let me tell you, at FDA, Alzheimer's is, in the hundreds of billions, but every regulatory decision involves so much money. And this is a story. I was somewhat involved in basically backing up a decision by the Center on Drugs that was a very, very technical determination about which company had the second drug on the market or something like that. And, I didn't decide it at all. There was no way that we were going to make a decision in the commissioner's office. This was just basically saying that the process that was used at the center had integrity. And one day I was at Hopkins and I left my office in Hampton House, and somebody was there looking at me, and I introduced herself to me and told me she was the CEO of one of the companies that kind of lost out in that decision. And she was at Hopkins and she just wanted to come by and say hello because she heard I was there. And I was like, oh, hello, will you walk with me to my next meeting? And so we were walking along Hopkins, and she turned to me, she said, you do know that cost me $1 billion, right? And then it's like, what do you say? I was like, sorry? Yeah, I don't know. But at FDA, everything has so much stakes for people. And it's really important. And that's why I personally think transparency and clarity ahead of time about some of these things is just really important. And when you have questions coming up where it feels like FDA is kind of making it up as it goes along, that isn't great for the agency's credibility, particularly when so much is at stake. And I'm sorry I can't speak with, a strong opinion about some of the more recent Alzheimer's stuff. Any other questions or comments on this?
Dr. Sharfstein, there is a question in the chat. Are you able to see it, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, if you could read it, that'd be great.
Okay. Why does the device division have a regulatory approach that differs so greatly from the biologicals and drug divisions? For instance, many of the currently using surgical robots were FDA cleared for use as a class 2 category using laparoscopic platforms as predicate device category. While this works well for the device company, most surgeons do not believe that laparoscopic devices should not be used as predicate for robotics.
Great question. We could do a whole session on device regulation. The easy answer is it's a different law. The more complicated answer is that you can't regulate devices as drugs because they're just fundamentally different things. You wouldn't do a large clinical trial for every iteration of a device if you can demonstrate that it's basically the same. Having said that, the even more complicated answer is that this regulatory standard where you're allowed to use a predicate has been very controversial, and in fact has led to all kinds of problems in the past. FDA, when I was there, did a whole review of this. They found all kinds of problems with the way the agency was doing this. In fact, when I was acting commissioner, I initiated a review that led FDA to try to revoke a clearance. So I'm very familiar with some of the challenges, and FDA is now embarked on a new trying to get the benefits of kind of the predicate process without some of the risks. And I think that if there's a particular kind of laparoscopic robot that that surgeons are worried about, then I think it's really important to raise that with FDA. And FDA does have some tools to look at and to learn from in terms of how to regulate the current devices, as well as how to change the use of predicates in the future. I think there's nobody who would say that FDA has hit the mark, but I don't think drug regulation is a reasonable standard. So you're sort of off on your own. And I would also say that, interestingly, even though we have a much looser approach to devices in this country, it's in some ways much stricter than other countries, including Europe. So it's really trying to find the best policy. And I was definitely involved in moving policy on devices, but it's still very much a work in progress. All right, why don't we keep going? Let me just talk a little bit about risk versus benefit. So diabetes medications, we'll come back to them. A number of drugs were found to have cardiac side effects, which is kind of a problem. FDA had to figure out, well, how do you balance these? And FDA did something pretty interesting here. It created guidance that said, we'll approve a diabetes drug if there's 95% confidence that the cardiovascular risk is less than 1.8 times greater. So at the time of approval, if you can exclude with 95% confidence 1.8 times risk, then you can be approved. But if you can exclude that, so that gives you a sense of how you have to power the study for cardiovascular endpoints. But then after approval, you have to do a safety study to demonstrate with 95% confidence that the risk is less than 1.3 times greater. And you think about why you have to do this, because it's not so much about the point estimate. What we're interested in is just making sure it's not horrible. And so FDA put this out there, and the goal was really for a company to start a safety study, to have a very restricted readout at the time of approval that they could exclude 1.8, and then complete the study. And that actually led to a number of diabetes drugs being approved, because you could say, well, look, given the risk of rosiglitazone or these other medicines, we need to do a full cardiovascular risk study, before we would approve one. And you could understand that argument. On the other hand, that's going to be a very, very long time. We have a lot of patients with diabetes. So this is a very thoughtful policy, in my view, on how to try to balance these in the development of the studies heading in. Now, this can go wrong, though, and FDA applied the same concept to an obesity drug called naltrexone bupropion, and the company, when the interim study came back, where you were trying to exclude 1.8 risk, the company publicly announced a benefit when the relative risk was 0.59, and they sought a patent for cardiovascular benefit. You guys know this better than me, but that was not the appropriate statistical conclusion so early in the trial, and it did not meet the certain tests that are set up for like very early results. And the fact that they did that and shared the results all over the place kind of polluted the rest of the safety study. It actually wound up getting stopped because it couldn't be done well after the company kind of blew it up. And follow-up data showed, in fact, that the relative risk started to inch up with every succeeding review of the data from 0.59 to 0.88 to 0.95. So it's unclear really what the cardiovascular risk of this medication was, that declaring victory at 0.59 was wrong. The company did that irresponsibly. I wound up writing an editorial about this, co-writing it for JAMA. And we wrote that repeated breaches of confidentiality may leave the FDA no alternative other than to require the full safety study prior to product approval. The demise of this study is a reminder that basing approval on interim safety data is a carefully drawn compromise, not an entitlement. It's interesting. This is not, a medicine that's being widely used in our day for obvious reasons. But I would just conclude here so we can have a little more time for discussion and say, FDA faces withering public scrutiny, has to address complex issues of clinical trial design and interpretation. These issues are still controversial. And I would point out to all of the people here that there's a lot of attention to individual drugs. There's very little attention comparatively to FDA's approach to these questions. I mean, academic attention. It's something that can be studied. It's something that you can work on by going to the FDA. And it's really important. How to resolve these kinds of questions has enormous implications for what medications are available. And so it's just a whole other avenue for people who are interested in the safety and effectiveness of medications is to work on the regulatory science of that. So maybe I will see if I can figure out how to stop my sharing and see if there are any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank
Hi.
you so much. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Holden.
No, go ahead. I already asked a question, so if there's time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharfstein. With your example with naltrexone bupropion, where the trial wasn't able to be completed, was that because the leaking of the results, then subjects didn't want to stay in the study because there was such evidence of a cardiovascular benefit? Was that the reason?
I think that was one of the reasons. I think that also that there was so much misinformation given about it, that it kind of, made it very hard to imagine and I think actually the academic investigators said we're not doing it.
Oh, wow. Because of these early results. And I think that kind of to your point brings up some of the issues with accelerated approval, because if subjects are enrolled in a study that helps lead to the accelerated approval, and then the drug gets on the market, if someone thinks they're in the placebo arm, the ability to actually complete these confirmatory clinical trials. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
There's absolute tension between these things. And can you complete the studies? Now, FDA has done some creative things there, including a typical thing is you get accelerated approval for a cancer treatment, but the definitive study is in a slightly different population, a slightly earlier population, not right about to die. That's where the accelerated approval is. And so a number of studies have been completed there. But for that reason, it's often felt like it's a good idea to have that study well underway at the time and not and very carefully messaged about what you're trying to do. Imagine we'll see whether that muscular dystrophy study can even read out at this point.
Thank you.
Ahmad?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharfstein, for this wonderful lecture. So just following up my question on the robotics, what are your thoughts on the determination and the pathway available to a company to take a very dangerous product to the market using the Class 2 approval pathway compared to going through Class 3? So again, example comes in mind, the Da Vinci surgical robot, or for example, if any of us today were to go get spine surgery, we would be getting it through the platform would be a Class 2 a clear device. It would not be a formal Class 3 case, even though that's a surgical robot, and many people believe that it is a very major invasive machine, and some people are baffled by how this can be classified as a device Class 2.
Well, class 2 and class 3 have different standards, and the class 2 standard is very flexible. So I think it kind of depends on, I think this is not an area that I've particularly worked on, I should tell you. So, but the kinds of questions I would ask is, what is the data that has been required? FDA can require clinical studies for class 2 drugs, and there's such a thing as de novo class 2 approval. So studies or companies can come in and provide data, for one. And then you have a challenge, obviously, if you're approving a platform and it can be used for like 20 different types of surgeries, what is a reasonable amount of data to require for each type of surgery versus a more general aspect of it. So it raises, a lot of interesting questions. I generally don't think first about class 2 versus class 3. I think first about, is the amount of data appropriate for what's being done? And if you think not, that's the argument to be made. And then one of the ways to resolve that could be class 2 or class 3, or what is required under class 2.
Thank you.
Sure. Teresa, why don't you call on people, because I don't
Sure.
know.
I think Janet has her hand up. If Janet, you want to
Oh,
know?
I still do have a question. In your last slide, you said the FDA is under, critical scrutiny. And between that Alzheimer's that we just talked about, and note that for lecanemab, the actual primary outcome was at 12 months, but for the approval, they changed it to 18 months because that's where they had an effect. And then on the other side of the coin, I don't know if you're at all aware of montelukast and Singulair and, black box warnings. And in 2018, they did, the best pharmacoepidemiology studies, and the one done on Sentinel says no risk.
Mhm.
Yet we keep marching forward, adding risk labels to an oral medication that is good for kids with asthma. And I just think it seems to be, from my uninformed perspective, just too much public pressure on their decisions.
Interesting. Well, I think one of the ways to, there is going to be public pressure on decisions. There are people who feel incredibly passionately about this. There are people who have been harmed by medications who, or devices have very, very strong views. You have companies with enormous financial interests, existential financial interests for them. So it is just the nature of FDA that it is going to be a place for a lot of conflict. The question is, how does FDA deal with it? And I have been, pretty solid on the fact that transparency is extremely important to deal with it. I think it helped us a lot with rosiglitazone. I think, the question that you're asking of, well, why do certain things get put on the label? What does how does the label get changed as more data comes in on the safety of a medication? Those are policy questions. Those should be set. FDA should be able to explain its approach to those things in a way that it helps. What happens is, and I can say this, so I've talked to so many people over the years about FDA, is when FDA does something, you get contrasting views of what FDA is really doing. Everybody's trying to figure out what's really going on because the agency is not explaining itself. So you might say, FDA feels obligated because of public pressure to put everything on the label. But someone else might say, FDA is just covering up for the pharmaceutical companies just in case there's an adverse effect. They're just throwing it in the label so that the company has some sort of defense. Well, why is FDA doing that? That's sort of what it really is behind what FDA is doing. FDA should have a policy, it should explain, it should be able to answer questions. And the idea of like, just trust us for the FDA, that if that ever existed, it definitely doesn't exist now. And so that's why, I spent time when I was at FDA launching a transparency effort that led to some changes. I've done other work on transparency since then, because I think it is the only way for FDA to get out of this, because you can really meet with people who don't agree on anything except for the fact that FDA got it completely wrong for the wrong reasons, no matter what, even for the same exact issue. And sometimes you'd see that the two articles, two different reporters used to write about FDA. One would be quoting the industry being really unhappy with the decision, and the other would quote consumer advocates unhappy about the same exact decision for completely different reasons, and FDA has never really explained itself.
Thank you, Jinshi. I think you have a question. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question about the accelerated approval. So I saw some criticism online saying FDA didn't really do a good job of monitoring the post-market or post-accelerated approval behavior of the drug, and it takes relatively longer time to withdraw stuff that shows unbeneficial or have high risk. So I was wondering if there is a timeline or if there's a team that's monitoring this part, or whether or not pharmaceutical companies doing their job, or this long time, like relative to us, relatively long time period is more of FDA is still trying to decide whether or not the lack of efficacy or
Yeah, I think
safety
there's
is.
general understanding that it takes, too long to do the follow-up studies, and I think that's why Congress gave FDA more power. In general, I think the FDA tends to think of these one drug at a time, and part of my suggestion is that the FDA think of this as a program. How's the program working? What can we learn from earlier experiences for future experiences? And I think that would help and help FDA explain its actions. But I do think on that particular point, people think that it has taken too long, and that's why there have been some changes. Let me just give you a sense. I want to end with something. I'm very curious. We're going to do a vote, so don't log off. It's going to be very quick. Here's the situation. You are the principal deputy commissioner at the FDA. This is ripped from my experiences, okay? There's an accelerated approval drug that was approved with the requirement that it do a confirmatory study. The drug was intended to deal with a disease that is associated with low blood pressure and dizziness, and people can't really do the activities of their life. And the surrogate, the intermediate endpoint, was blood pressure. But there was no study done to show it actually made people less dizzy. And the drug got sold from multiple companies, and no study was ever done. And so the agency came and said, we want to take this medicine off the market. They announced that they were going to take the medicine off the market. And then your phone rings, and it's a doctor from Baltimore who says that they have patients. This is the only drug that makes their life bearable. That there's never been a negative study, but there's never been a positive study on clinical benefit. But, blood pressure is dizziness. So why aren't we just, allowing these poor people to take the medicine? And so the question is, what do you do, right? Are you willing to take it off the market and say, well, sorry, you had multiple chances. This was your responsibility. Or are you going to leave it on the market? So because even though the company hasn't completed the study, these are the kinds of questions that come up. And I think you get a sense from this discussion of just how challenging, and there's so many questions. So let's see. Everyone's got to vote. Raise your hand like you're asking a question. If I can't do a poll fast enough, so just quick answer. You're taking it off the market. They didn't do the study they promised to do. How many people? Okay, good. And now, how many people say, this is a tough one, but, there are multiple companies involved, blah, 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 blah. We're not taking it off the market. So I see a few people here. Hold on. Just a couple people. Interesting. Let me see if I can find this. For whatever it's worth, I'm going to put this in the chat. and just tell you there are no easy answers. You can see what we wound up doing. Thank you very much for the chance to, and the answer is, can't you require a trial? Believe me, we required a trial. Millions of times we required a trial. I actually wanted NIH to do a trial because the company, I think, actually gone generic. You can see. Anyway, it's an interesting article.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Teresa, for having me. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for chatting with us. There is one question from Sarah in the chat. I don't know if you have a
Sure.
minute to address that.
Yep.
Want me to read it or you can pull it up?
Oh, about the Transparency Initiative? Yeah, I would say that FDA has done a few small things on transparency, but we have a whole agenda on transparency. If you look at the Journal of Health Politics, Policy, and Law, we put together a whole agenda, and I don't really think FDA has gotten to let's see, here's blueprint for transparency. Yeah, this is a here's the blueprint that we did. We actually published in a whole issue about this. Dr. Caleb wrote a commentary about it, which you can see his thoughts on it. It's very hard to prioritize transparency because FDA is immersed in all these individual efforts, and transparency feels like more work, and in many cases it is more work. So it's like, oh, can't we just deal with these challenges that are facing us right now? But I think that by not really addressing transparency as much as the agency could, it makes it harder ultimately for people to understand what's going on, and it raises the controversy level in general of the agency. So I think I personally think there could be more done.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming to chat with us this morning. I'm sure the students and faculty alike appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay. All right. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next month.